Welcome to Train, Recover, Win and the coverage of the conference that we did recently in Orlando at the Florida Medical Cannabis Conference. We're going to be talking about the role of cannabinoids in influencing human performance at an elite level. My name is Don Moxley. I'm an exercise physiologist and sports scientist, and a lot of this is coming from the work that I've done past as a sports scientist, and then integrating that with work we've been doing lately, working in the medical cannabis field. A lot of this work comes from the work that we did with the Ohio State wrestling team from 2015 through 2018, and we'll call on that as we go through the presentation. In this presentation, we're going to talk about a model for long-term athlete development. We're also going to be identifying processes for tracking elite athletes in that development process. We're going to present a model for why athletes will have maladaptation problems. And finally, we're going to talk about how to use cannabinoids to influence this process of performance. So, one of the things that's important when we're dealing with athletics is that, it's never possible to guarantee a win or a loss. But at the same time, we can increase the probability of success while decreasing the probability of failure in both teams and individuals. And that's what we're really working on in this model. So as we move through the model as an exercise professional or a coach, you design workouts, and workouts I call as a box of stress. And that box of stress, the height of the box is the intensity, and then the width of the box is the duration of the workout. And then what we put in the box is what we call the mode, and that's, whether it's cardiovascular, skill, or strength. And then what we do is we take these boxes and we systematically plan them out through the week. And when we're doing our box of stress correctly, the flat gray line here represents homeostasis. But if we attach a box of stress to that line, what we're going to see is we'll see a disruption in homeostasis. We're actually going to see it start to move down, so that when we finish a workout, we're actually weaker than we are at the start. But with appropriate recovery, we see what's called supercompensation. We establish a new level of homeostasis. When we put a box of stress on that, we again repeat the process. We see the degradation. We see super recovery and supercompensation, and we keep moving through this process. And this is the way things are supposed to work when we're designing workouts. Now, one of the things that we see, and when we're talking about the role of endocannabinoids, is that when we're working on these exercise programs, one of the things that drives a lot of this is the fact that this endocannabinoid system is one of the elements that creates the euphoria that comes with training. So what we found is that movement actually drives the production of endocannabinoids, and this is an evolutionary rewarding process that we see, whether it comes from persistence hunting. We see it in a lot of different animals. We'll talk more about it in a little bit, but what we see is dogs increase in anandamide, ferrets increase in anandamide with movement, as well as humans. And then we see another article where it talks about that runner's high depending on the cannabinoid receptors. So we not only do we see a production of endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, but we see the role of the receptors being critical in this. And when we see those receptors, we see them move up in all conditions as it relates to, and this is a mouse study looking at running on a wheel. We see that anandamide increase. So, at the end of the day, when we're looking at exercise, when we're looking at movement, there's no doubt that the endocannabinoid system is not only driving that process, but being affected by it as well. So the challenge comes is that when we don't have good recovery, and that line that comes off of the stress box, I call that the angle of recovery. And if we have an angle of recovery coming off, first of all, that angle can be too steep. Is that if that box of stress isn't appropriate and that angle is too steep and we throw the next box in too early, we're never going to get the supercompensation. But also if we had a clouded recovery schedule, that if the athlete is struggling with a relationship, if there's food, if there's trauma, there's a lot of things that can go into disrupting recovery. And when we have this disrupted recovery, when we have too steep an angle of recovery, we start to see an athlete that's moving towards an injury state. Now, how can we track this? Well, there's a lot of really good science that shows that if we take a look at the heart rate variability, so we're going to put an athlete in a wearable device, it's going to measure, this is a straight V6, and we're looking at the R to R intervals. And when we look at those intervals, we're able to measure the distance or the difference between 256 beats, and this is what we call heart rate variability. And when we have heart rate variability measured, what we see is that an increase in heart rate variability, regardless of whether it's coming from biofeedback or anything else, is going to result in improved performance. We'll talk more about this, but it's pretty well established in the literature. The other thing that we said is the effect of cannabis on heart rate variability. We see an increase with cannabis use in heart rate variability, but we'll talk more about that. It's not all cannabis use, but some cannabis use can show an increase in this variability. So, with the heart rate variability, the thing we want to be thinking about is that when variability is low, the athlete is in a fight or flight. They're in a sympathetic mode, and when the heart rate variability is high, they're in a parasympathetic mode. So when we're working with athletes, we're moving back and forth between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. When we're in the sympathetic fight or flight mode, we're spilling hormones that cause us to release energy. We're spilling cortisol. We're spilling adrenaline. We're spilling noradrenaline. These are all hormones that are causing us to be able to escape. And then when we move into a parasympathetic status, we're now moving into a place where we can recover. So we're getting the testosterones and the IGFs. These are the hormones that are helping us recover. Now, when we take a look at this fight or flight mechanism, and again, fight or flight, if a bear walked her through the door right now, you'd go full fight or flight. And then the other side of this, the parasympathetic, what we call rest and digest. This is the recovery side. And when we take a look at these, we can look at this with heart rate variability studies. And this is a longer 24-hour study. And this is an example of what good recovery looks, because we're looking at the HRV throughout sleep. And what you'll see in this sleep area here is that we've got good, the athlete goes to bed and we've got good recovery. Now, when we take a look at this, this is an athlete that's had 4 beers before they went to bed. And what you see is that athlete's carrying the sympathetic load into the night, and it's essentially cutting their recovery in half. I think this is the same thing that you're going to see if you have too much THC consumption as well. You're going to see the extension of the anxiety, and we see this in the literature. A lot of people talk about an increased anxiety with the consumption of too much THC. So this is one of the reasons that you've got to be careful about that THC consumption. We don't see this with CBD, but we definitely see it with THC consumption. So we're taking a look at nighttime resting, what's called RMSSDs, and this is another example of the value of HRV in predicting success. And this is work that we did with the wrestling team, and that 129 there, that's an Olympic gold medalist, and the 110 is a national champion. This 98 is also a national champion. The 95 here is a CrossFit world champion. The 93 is someone who finished 3rd in the country, so this is an All-American, still a very good performance. What we see down here is a 45. That 45 is low enough that athlete was not able to achieve All-American status. That same athlete the next year came into the tournament with a 75 and was able to achieve All-American status. So this is where we go into being able to see how can HRV be used to predict success. Well, this is one of the examples of where we've seen that. So when we start taking a look at fear, again, this is the lion walking through the door. We have full activation of the sympathetic side, and we have no parasympathetic response here. And the other side of that is peace. So we have full parasympathetic. This is what happens when you're fishing. When you're not thinking about anything but the line in the water, there's no fear. This is full parasympathetic. Now, what we see though is when we see a co-stimulation of both sympathetic and parasympathetic, this is when we start to see valor, or we start to see people going into flow. And we've seen this in athletes many times. There's a lot of times when you're going into a competition, it's difficult not to have a fear response. It's only natural that you have a sympathetic response going into practice or going into competition. But what we're able to do is create a co-stimulation of the parasympathetic side to get into this flow or this valor state. The question is what are the requisite underlying physiological conditions that are required to be able to get that parasympathetic bump? Now, when we take a look at this, this was a fascinating paper that we came across, and it's looking at fear conditioning in fear extinction in mice. And what we see is that with the fear conditioning process, we actually see a drop of anandamide in the amygdala of the mice. So it looks like this is an evolutionary response that if you are born into a situation where it requires vigilance in order to survive, the body's going to respond by creating a vigilant state, a hypervigilant state, and it's doing it by a drop of anandamide in the amygdala. And what we see is with the fear extinction, we actually see a rise of the endocannabinoid anandamide in the amygdala. So as I take a look at this paper, I think of all the people who may be using cannabis, whether they're post-traumatic stress or whether they're athletes, is that are they really using the cannabis just in a process of trying to normalize their anandamide levels in their amygdala to be able to exit the hypervigilant state for a period of time? The other thing that's interesting that we find is that when we have a stress situation, we have an inflammatory response in the cell. And in that inflammatory response, the normal inflammatory response, we see omega-6 fats, arachidonic acid, being converted down through the COX and LOX enzymatic behaviors to become prostaglandins and your other inflammatory responses. But at the same time, we're seeing the omega-6s. We see omega-3s also being processed in that same process to become pro-resolution mediators. So these become the chemicals that are cleaning up the cells. And this is the breakdown of the omega-3s, DHA, and EPA. And what we find is that these omega-3s are actually bonding to the CB2 receptors in the cells. So we're seeing an activation of the endocannabinoid system through this resolution process. So as we take a look at what we've worked on so far today, is that in this long-term athlete development, we have a process where we're applying stress, we weaken the system responds with hyper response, and we get a stronger athlete. And that's only if we have the ability to get a quality recovery. We're able to track this recovery. We're able to track this process using heart rate variability. And using the heart rate variability, we're able to see the status of that central nervous system. Are you sympathetic dominant? Are you parasympathetic dominant? Are you cycling appropriately? And in athletes, too many times we have a situation where everyone's going hard, but we're not paying attention to quality of recovery. And a lot of times these recoveries can be clouded. That if you have an athlete that may have dealt with trauma in the past, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse, the data shows that 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys are having to deal with some type of sexual abuse now by the time they're 18. 1 in 6 women are either raped or having to deal with an attempted rape by the time they're 25. Whether it's trauma from poverty or trauma from abuse, there's a lot of things that are driving the trauma response. And this is the reason you can have a team of athletes that have completely different responses to a training effect. Athlete A, who has grown up in a non-traumatic environment, has an improved ability to recover because that angle of recovery is not as steep because they don't have the hypervigilance. So as we start to take a look at recovery in athletics, we need to pay attention to, can we use cannabinoids as a tool for driving or at least supplementing this recovery process? That the cannabinoids can become a vitamin, for say, that if someone has a citric acid deficiency, It makes no difference how much macronutrient they have, whether it's in carbohydrate or fat or protein. If there's a citric acid, a micronutrient deficiency, there's a breakdown in the ability of the system to grow and process. Well, when we take a look at the stress process, a lot of times I think we have to pay attention to, does this athlete or does this individual have the requisite underlying chemical processes necessary in order to drive recovery. And this is where we go back to Ethan Russo's statement of there being a potential cannabinoid deficiency that we need to treat within the population. So I want to thank you for your time and taking a look at this quick presentation. Hope you have a good night, and God bless.